They laughed openly, not behind her back, not in whispers meant to spare her feelings. They laughed where she could hear them. The room wasn't quiet enough to hide it and not loud enough to pretend it was harmless. It was the kind of laughter that fills space easily, confident and careless, the kind that assumes it has permission. She stood there, holding her glass, fingers wrapped tightly around it, listening as her name floated casually between jokes. They spoke about her life as if it were a story they had already finished reading, as if they knew how it ended, as if her struggles were amusing footnotes rather than moments she had survived. Someone commented on her job. Someone else mentioned her relationship. Another laughed about something she had once shared in confidence. Each remark landed softly, but together they weighed heavy. She felt the familiar pressure in her chest, the instinct to explain, to correct, to defend herself before the narrative hardened into truth. But she didn't speak. She looked down at her glass instead, watching the ice melt slowly, listening to the sound of laughter rise and fall without her. Someone noticed her silence and nudged her lightly. "Come on," they said with a smile, "we're just joking." She nodded. She always nodded. She had learned that skill early, the ability to absorb discomfort without reacting, to swallow words before they could betray emotion, to make herself smaller when a room demanded it. It had once been survival. Now it felt like clarity. They had known her for years, long enough to know her history, long enough to recognize the things she never spoke about, long enough to understand where the lines were and how easily they could cross them. That was the part that stayed with her later, not the jokes themselves, the precision. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway. She excused herself quietly, not wanting to draw attention. No dramatic exit, no lingering looks, just a soft apology that no one really heard. Outside, the night air felt cooler than she expected. She stood there for a moment, breathing slowly, letting the noise fade behind her. Her reflection stared back from the darkened glass of a nearby window, unfamiliar and tired. She asked herself the question she would replay for weeks afterward. Why didn't I say anything? She ran through the answers one by one. Fear, shock, exhaustion. But none of them felt quite right. The truth came later, when the room was quiet and no one else was listening. She didn't speak because she already knew it wouldn't matter. Explaining yourself to people who enjoy misunderstanding you is a special kind of loneliness. It requires effort, vulnerability, and the willingness to believe that honesty will be met with respect. She no longer believed that. The next morning, the embarrassment tried to take shape. It always does. It creeps in slowly, whispering questions meant to turn pain inward. Why did you let that happen? Why didn't you stand up for yourself? Why do you always freeze? She let the thoughts pass without engaging them. She had learned that too. The people from that night reached out later. Casual messages, light-hearted follow-ups, invitations phrased as if nothing unusual had occurred. One person joked again, referencing the same thing that had made her uncomfortable. She didn't respond, not immediately, not ever. She began to notice how often this pattern repeated itself, not just with those people, but with others too. How familiarity turned into entitlement, how kindness was mistaken for permission, how silence was interpreted as agreement. She saw it everywhere once she learned how to look. She stopped sharing personal details, not out of bitterness, out of awareness. She realized that access to her life had been handed out freely, without question, without boundaries, and not everyone who received it had treated it with care. So she pulled back, quietly, deliberately. The change was subtle at first. She spoke less in group settings. She listened more than she contributed. She chose her words carefully, or not at all. People noticed. They always do. They called her distant. They said she had changed. They joked that success had made her cold. She didn't correct them. There is a strange power in letting people misunderstand you. It removes the pressure to perform, to convince, to prove. She realized that not every version of her needed to be corrected. Some misunderstandings were earned. Time passed. It always does. And with it came shifts she hadn't announced. Opportunities appeared quietly. Progress unfolded without ceremony. Her life grew fuller in ways that had nothing to do with validation. She didn't post about it. She didn't explain it. She didn't trace the path for anyone else to follow. She simply lived it. The same people who once laughed began to ask questions. Curious ones, polite ones. How did you do it? When did things change? What happened? She smiled when they asked, the kind of smile that didn't invite conversation. She gave vague answers, neutral responses, nothing they could build a story from. They wanted context. She gave them silence. She realized something important then. People often want explanations not to understand you, but to place you back into a version of yourself that feels familiar to them. She had outgrown that version, and she wasn't interested in being reintroduced. There were moments, of course, when the old instinct resurfaced, times when she felt the urge to justify herself, to make things clear, to defend choices that no longer required approval. But she reminded herself of that night, the laughter, the casual cruelty, the certainty with which they had spoken about her life. She reminded herself that clarity is wasted on those who prefer entertainment. Years later, she ran into one of them unexpectedly, a chance encounter, neutral ground. They greeted her warmly, almost eagerly, as if time had softened everything that came before. They commented on how well she looked, how confident she seemed, how different she was now. She thanked them. They paused, then said something that caught her off guard. "You know, we never really understood you back then." She smiled politely. She didn't explain herself. Some truths don't need to be spoken to be understood. Some boundaries are most effective when they're invisible. She learned that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself in moments of conflict. It doesn't demand attention or recognition. It shows up later, in who has access to you, in what you no longer tolerate, in the silence you choose instead of unnecessary explanations. They humiliated her once. They expected a reaction. They expected justification. They expected her to play the role they had assigned her. She didn't. And in doing so, she quietly stepped out of their story. Not everyone will understand your silence. That's okay. It was never meant for them. Some people mistake restraint for weakness. Others recognize it for what it is. Strength that no longer needs to be proven. She said nothing, and that changed everything.